Welcome to Public Affairs Public Access. I'm your host for tonight, George Reiter. I'm a professor of physics at the University of Houston. I'm also the co-chair of the Harris County Green Party. What I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is at the interface between science, technology, and politics. We'll be talking about climate change, what can happen if we don't do anything, what kinds of things can we do, what kind of technologies are available, how much would they cost? What kind of possibilities do we have for a future when we've succeeded in handling this problem? Probably many of you saw the spread in the Chronicle a couple of days ago, where the government has issued a statement essentially saying climate change is not something which is coming. Climate change is something which is here now. The huge storms, tornadoes more than a mile in diameter, the floods, the droughts, the year that we had here in Houston, unprecedented high temperatures for the summer, 100 days, over 100, that these are not random, unusual, but random events from a climate system which is stable. These are what you expect from a climate system which is undergoing change. The predictions of that study were that if we do nothing by the end of this century, the oceans will be 4 to 9 feet higher than they are now, which means that many coastal cities will be, if they can't afford the kind of extensive dikes and pumps and stuff that are necessary to maintain a city when it's 4 feet below sea level, will be gone. Populations will have to move. There will be, populations are actually already moving because of this. Animal species will move as they move into areas where they can still survive. Areas where we could have farmed will become arid. There may be places opening up which will allow us to continue farming at presumably further north, some areas anyway. But these changes will be occurring on a scale and on a time scale that will make it very, very difficult for people to adapt to. There's another aspect to this which is not generally understood, I think, and I want to try to make clear, which is that this is not a process of, necessarily a process of gradual increase in intensity of storms and intensity of droughts and so on, but within more or less the same patterns that we've lived with for centuries. A Gulf Stream that flows up north into the Atlantic and provides the warmth for Europe that would make it, if it stopped flowing, would make it essentially barely habitable for most of Europe. And that's one of the predictions of what might happen if the system changes discontinuously, practically discontinuously, over a very short period of time. It's possible for chaotic systems, like our climate, to move from being in one, what's called a basin of attraction, which is to say, a pattern that repeats itself, not perfectly, but you know, the Gulf Stream moves as it usually does. We have El Niños sometimes, sometimes not. The jet stream may move some, but it stays more or less in the same place. It's possible for chaotic systems like that to change into a completely different pattern, a pattern which is very, very difficult to predict, which would happen in such a short period of time that it's very unlikely that we would be able to adapt to it. And that's really it isn't even the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that as a consequence of these changes, various feedback effects occur where you warm up the planet a bit and the permafrost up in the northern latitudes and the very southern latitudes, which has been frozen all these years, which contains within it methane, begins to melt at a significant rate, releasing the methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere, enhancing the heating process, enhancing the flow of methane out from the permafrost into the atmosphere. A feedback process which continues to the point where we move not from a habitable climate that we have now, or even one, broadly different, but with regions of habitation within it, to the kind of situation that we have on Venus, where you have essentially greenhouse gases so intense that the planet is at 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlivable for certainly us. Perhaps some microbes might survive. That's also a possibility if we do nothing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Control, which is put out preceding the U.S. government statement, put out a paper which is very, very complete. They assess the various risks involved and say what their uncertainties are. And they say essentially we have 15 years to reverse the trend of increasing greenhouse gases, mostly CO2, and turn that trend around so that more CO2 is being absorbed, primarily in the oceans, but by plants, by forests, so that the continual increase is stopped, it turns around fast enough that the kinds of possibilities I've been talking about don't develop. So the question then for us, and what I want to talk about is, how can we do that? What's possible now? What could we do? What's available technologically? And we'll also talk about what's possible politically. But of course, what's possible politically really depends upon you to a great extent. So let me begin with where we're at in terms of our energy usage and how it's made up. What kinds of energy do we use, and how much of it of various kinds? So let's go to our first slide. What you see is that the yellow, the purple, and the orangey areas, those are all fossil fuels. And they constitute 80% of the total energy consumption in the United States. The little sliver is 9%, and that's what's called renewable energies. So that's things like solar energy, captured either with photovoltaics, the kinds of things you see on the top of some buildings, and many stores now are beginning to use them, where the sunlight is converted directly into electricity, and you can use it to power your home, for instance. Or solar power collected by more centralized means, where you have reflectors, for instance, which concentrate a beam of sunlight on basically a pipe, essentially, which you've got some kind of a fluid, which you heat up, turn it into steam if it's water, or something else if it's not, which becomes a gas, which can turn a turbine, which can then generate electricity. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is wind turbines. We've all seen them around now. They're common enough that we get what's happening there. We have basically the wind flowing, turning a windmill, essentially, and that turns a generator producing electrical power. You can't do that everywhere. You have to have wind speeds of about, 6 miles an hour in order to make that useful, but that exists in many places. Then, of course, there's other possibilities that are renewable, burning wood, for instance. In this case, when you burn it, you put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, but the wood itself, when it grew, took the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so it's neutral. You're putting back what was taken out earlier. You're not changing the carbon balance, really, on the planet at all, and you're not changing, most importantly, the CO2 balance in the air by doing that. There are others, hydroelectric power, for instance. We have, of the renewables, it's the largest, it's that blue section at the bottom. That's the largest contribution to renewable energy is actually hydroelectric. But again, of course, they're limited how many dams you can build. There are some places where you can, and obviously most places you can't. So that's the situation. We're going to be talking about a future in which solar energy and or wind energy become the primary means for our powering our planet. Let me say, if you would like to call in and ask a question at any point, please do so. The number is 713-807-1794. Please do call. I much prefer having questions when they're there rather than to speak around things and leave you with doubts about what I'm talking about. And I'll answer them as best I can. So that's the situation in the United States. A tiny sliver of that 9%, 1% of the 9%, is now produced by solar energy here, of any kind. About 12% of that 9% is produced by wind. The wind power industry has been rapidly growing. I'm told that the subsidies for it have stopped and the growth has basically stopped. These things will not be developed in a competitive economy such as the one we have, because at the moment they aren't competitive with fossil fuels. It's much cheaper, not including, of course, the cost of climate change, but it's much cheaper to, even given the cost of finding it and pulling it out of the ground, refining it, getting it to you. It's a very, very energy-intensive source of, it's a very compact source of energy. 1 gallon of gas you can drive for 50 miles, 70 miles. There'll be cars driving for more than that. And certainly conservation is something we need to do. But we can't conserve our way out of this. We have to find some way of replacing that 80% with renewable energy. And we have to do it fast enough so that we turn around the CO2 emissions within 15 years. That's the problem we're facing. It isn't particular to the United States. The next slide shows you the situation for the world. And it's basically the same. Very small amounts of solar energy, somewhat larger amounts of wind power, but still a small sliver, the small green sliver over there to the left. It's not a significant proportion even of renewable energies yet. So what do we do? Well, this is a global problem. There are other countries in the world who haven't had the kind of political backlash to even acknowledging that there is a global climate crisis upon us. And so they've actually been able to move forward in trying to move to alternative energies. Germany is at the forefront of that. The next slide shows some of the different types of renewable energy. The yellow curve at the bottom, I want to call your attention to, is particularly interesting because it's the growth in solar energy of all kinds, basically. It's now 5.3% of, or it was in 2012, it'd be more like about 9% if it continues growing at that rate. And in 15 years, it'll be perhaps 35% of the total energy budget of Germany. That's commendable. It was produced by subsidies. The Germans were paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour to put photovoltaics on your roof, and you could sell the power back at that rate, which is about 3 times what we're paying, and I presume about 3 times what they were paying for fossil fuel energy. They've reduced the subsidy now. The program has been successful. They've reduced the subsidy now to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, but still it needs to be subsidized, and it happens because of government efforts. You can see also that there's been a increase in, it's the purple one here at the top, in wind power at the same time, which is actually also the largest percentage of renewable energy there. And the bottom line of that is it's not enough. It's commendable, but it's not enough. And we're going to get to the reasons why it's not enough in just a moment, but some of you may have heard, I know I've heard it, it's been going around, that the Germans were actually generated 35% of their total energy with solar energy. That's true, actually, but that was just for a short period of time. That was at high noon, no clouds, perfect visibility, and you were then able to produce that much energy. On average, however, because you don't always have those conditions, and because, of course, solar energy is only available for about 8 hours a day, which is when the sun's high enough in the horizon in the morning and still high enough in the evening so that the sunlight's coming down more or less directly to be useful. Let's look at some of those constraints. Let's go to the next slide. So these are some numbers that need to be kept in mind. The first one is very comforting in a way. The power available from sunlight at noon, it's actually more than 1,000 watts per square meter. That's to say every piece of whatever, land, photovoltaic cell, which is about that big, 1 kilowatt of power from the sun is available to be converted into electricity if you can do it, either by photovoltaics or by turning it into heat and running a turbine. Now, you can't get all of that energy out. Typical photovoltaics that you might use commercially, which have to be pretty cheap to make, have efficiencies on the order of 10%. But things are worse because, again, you only have that 8 hours, and you also have the problem of clouds and rain and so on. So that, skipping down to the third line there, typically you might be able to get 5 to 20 watts per meter, and that's probably an overestimate, per square meter, that should say. From however you do it, that's what's available from the sunlight. You still have the efficiencies of conversion to be worrying about. The second line there is from a project which tries to get through the problem of having weather, which prevents you from using the sunlight, by collecting the sunlight on the moon and beaming it back to the Earth with microwaves. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. You can choose the microwaves to be whatever frequency you want and whatever intensity you want. It's completely at your disposal, and so you can choose them to be at a frequency that will penetrate the atmosphere, whether there are clouds there or dust particles. It doesn't really matter. As we'll see later, it doesn't even matter whether it's the Earth is facing the moon or not. And so that provides a much higher energy density to work with. And finally, there's the power available from wind power. Now, there, essentially, you can't put them too close together. And how close you put them together depends upon the diameter of the windmills. So there's a kind of limitation then. And of course, the wind only blows so fast, so much. The estimate there is of power of about 2.2 watts per meter, so much smaller per square meter. That estimate was, by the way, from a book by David Mackey, who's a professor of physics at Cambridge, called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. He intends that to be an easily readable book for anyone who's interested in this. These kinds of estimates are done in considerable detail and in a way that anyone with even a smattering of a science education can understand them. High school physics is plenty good enough. So that's it. We have this very, very high intensity source. It's difficult to make use of it because on the planet because of the issues I've raised before. We have other alternatives. I haven't mentioned here much. For instance, the waves. You can harness the waves to get some power out of that. The tides, the flow of water back and forth, you can get energy out of that. There's geothermal energy. Some places, I mean, if you're living in Yellowstone or somewhere near Yellowstone, you can probably do quite a lot with geothermal energy. But not everybody has a supervolcano under their under the ground to provide that kind of energy. David Mackey did some estimates for England. We'll go to the next slide. Unfortunately, it's too long, the slide that is, so I can only show you the two halves separately. But he did a comparison between, on the left-hand side in pink, is the various uses for energy. So we see, for instance, and I'll have to put my glasses on to see it. We see, for instance, cars, airplanes, gadgets, electric lights, all of the kinds of day-to-day things that we need energy for. It's expended in different forms. On the right-hand side, he has all of the ways we might provide it. And it's done in kilowatt hours per day. And those little blocks there on the right are the kind of sources that I mentioned before. Again, the top two are actually wind and solar. This is for England. And he said we could do this. It's technically possible to do this. We could pretty much match what we're using now to what we could produce with renewable energies, with existing technology, without having to do anything very profound in the way of developing something new. But you see all the crosses in there. Well, the crosses are what he estimates would be the political problems to actually doing it. Not in my backyard. We saw that. We saw that recently in off of Cape Cod. The plan was to put windmills out in the ocean, which is a pretty good place to put them, not too far offshore, so you can get the power in easily, but close enough that you could see it. And the people in Cape Cod didn't want that. It spoiled their view. And that will be the case in many, many other places. There are trade-offs for all of these things. Down in Texas, for instance, one place to build these wind farms turns out to be an area which is essentially a wildlife preserve. You could do it with not too much destruction with roads. You might be able to sort of make some compromise, but there are compromises that you come to when you start thinking about how we're actually going to get that much power. Let me go to the next slide. This is an article that was written by a Stanford professor who, one Stanford professor and one University of California professor, both engineers, and they've been working for some years on the question of how do we replace all of fossil fuel energy with renewable energy. It's something which humanity must do eventually. How can we do it fast enough? And they've also answered the question of what will it cost? First, let me talk a little bit about, and so this, I'm not saying that they've got their estimates all completely correct, but they've done an honest job of trying to come up with the numbers and the technologies and the ideas, what balance of solar and wind and the various other renewable energies should be used. This is what they say is necessary. So this is what we need in order to completely replace fossil fuels with essentially electrical power generated with renewable sources. Now, some things, of course, like airplane fuel, you can't run a wire for that. And so this includes the idea of moving to a hydrogen economy, where if you have cheap enough electricity, you can pay the energy cost for separating water into hydrogen and oxygen, ship the hydrogen, burn it when you need to. The combustion product is back to water again. Doesn't produce any smog. You can run your cars on it. And that's how we would do transportation and those things where you can't use electrical energy directly. So it's a complete replacement for our fossil fuel systems that we have now. And this is what it would take. It would take 3,800,000 5-megawatt wind turbines. It would take 49,300 megawatt concentrated solar plants. Those are the kind where you focus the sunlight on something where you're producing some kind of gas that runs through a turbine, generates your electricity. It would produce, it would need 40,300 megawatt solar photovoltaic power plants. So about the same number each, about 90,000 power plants altogether. It includes 1.7 billion 3-kilowatt rooftop photovoltaic systems, but frankly, they don't make a significant contribution to the total energy needs. So the idea that somehow we're going to get out of this by just putting solar panels on everybody's rooftop, that might work if it wasn't more cost effective to use concentrated solar systems. In any case, that's their prediction. And then there are 5,100 megawatt geothermal power plants, 2,700 new hydroelectric power plants, 720,000 0.75 megawatts. So these are much smaller wave devices. You get the idea. Very, very large numbers of these are needed, but that's what it'll take. And that's a calculation which, you can do with the numbers that I showed earlier. You make some assumption about what your average energy is going to be based on the efficiency of your photovoltaics. You make that practical. You have some estimate of what fraction of the time you're going to be able to have sunlight. These systems require batteries, some means of storing power, or of transferring it around from regions of the country and of the world where I'm told that the west coast of the United States for 3 weeks was one time overcast. You couldn't have generated any solar energy. So you have to be able to move things around in that, and that's also part of the expense of the project. Let me say again that if you're interested in calling in, the phone is available. The number will come up on the screen in just a moment. To ask whatever question you want about any of these estimates, about any of the, we're about to get into the costs of doing all of this. So they've also costed it out. And their idea is, and it seems like a good one, is to begin by building no new fossil fuel plants. That everything that goes in place for the next 15 years is renewable. At the end of that time, you would begin dismantling or putting in mothballs. You can use them as backup, for instance. That'd be fine if you didn't run them too long. You begin not using the fossil fuel plants and you replace them with renewables so that by 2050, we're completely off of fossil fuels. That's the plan. Now, of course, the costs of that depend upon the present-day costs of photovoltaics, for instance, but if you mass produce all of this stuff, by the time you get 15 years out, you're going to it'll be a lot cheaper to buy photovoltaics. And they've estimated those things as well. At present day prices, to do all this in, well, we have about 35 years till 2050, would be $66 trillion. Let me say that again. $66 trillion. So the U.S. budget is about $1 trillion. I'm sorry, it's about $11 trillion. So it's a lot of money, but on the other hand, it's spent over 45 years. And if you think about what the costs of not doing it are, cities becoming unusable, the whole range of catastrophes that I began with, well, it starts to seem a reasonable cost. And in a certain sense, it's actually the hidden cost of the fossil fuel economy. We've never been charged at the pump the price of destabilizing the atmosphere, the cost of the damage from tornadoes and droughts and floods that we're already experiencing. That hasn't been borne by, well, it will eventually be borne by all of us, but it hasn't been borne in the cost of what you pay for fossil fuels at the pump. So in some sense, this is a reasonable price to pay for having a livable world. It's still a bit pricey. Are there other alternatives? There are. There's a project that's been worked on for about 30 years by my colleague David Criswell. He had a colleague working with him on that, and other people. He ran the Institute for Space Sciences at the University of Houston for many years, and was responsible for reviewing proposals for use of the moon during the Apollo program era, and when people were thinking about ways of using the moon, and got to see all of the reports back on what kind of materials the moon was made of, etc. So he's very, very knowledgeable about what's available on the moon and what kind of costs are needed to do what I had suggested earlier, which is to collect solar energy on the moon and beam it back to the Earth. So on the next slide, you see the overall system in place. The reason for collecting solar energy on the moon is it's completely reliable. There is no atmosphere there. The energy available is about the same as it is on the Earth. It's about a kilowatt per square meter. And there's at least 600 times more energy there than we could possibly use on the planet. So we have to collect only a small fraction of it and get it back to the Earth somehow. How do we collect it? How do we get it back to the Earth? Well, the predecessor to this project was one that actually received a considerable amount of play in the press, both at the time of the Apollo era and even to this day. You'll see articles about, well, why don't we send up satellites which will collect solar energy and then beam it back with microwaves to the planet? And the cost of that turns out to be prohibitive because the mass that you have to put up into orbit to do this is just too much. The cost of doing that is just way too much for the kind of energy that you could get back. The moon, however, you don't have to put up in orbit. It's there already. And it's free. You just have to get there. And so the idea is to send up essentially a boarding party to land on the moon with equipment to build solar panels. Factories to build solar panels and to build microwave receivers and to build the kind of living arrangements that you need to keep something between 500 and 5,000 people, a moon colony, functioning as the solar panels and these microwaves are built, and you begin beaming it back to the Earth. The estimated cost of doing that within about 15 years, 10 to 15 years, depending upon how quickly we get to it and how much energy we put into it, is about $1 trillion. Still a large amount of money, but it's roughly twice what we spend on the military in a year, and it's roughly twice what it costs to maintain the existing fossil fuel system. That is to dig up find new oil, dig it up, run it through the pipelines, ship it on the freighters, refine it, and get it to you. $600 million a year just to do that, to keep it all going. So in that sense, it's really quite inexpensive. And it's doable. The technology exists to get to the moon. We've done that. The technology is to live on the moon. Well, we can live in space. It's a lot easier to live on the moon. At least you have gravity. You drop a tool, it lands. It doesn't float off somewhere. So this is all doable. The radar technology has been around for 30, 40 years. It enables you to send back multiple beams to the Earth. I think I'll show you what it would look like. This is, again, these are essentially artist sketches. What's needed is a massive and immediate engineering evaluation of the proposal, of the best ways to do this now with existing technology. The proposal was really put in place about 20 years ago and could have been done with 20-year-old technology. Things have changed. There are probably better ways to do it. It's probably cheaper to do it. The moon base would look something like what we see on the screen, which is the moon with craters. These are actually reflectors for transmitters, which would beam microwaves at the reflectors and then back to the Earth. Now, the other advantage of the moon, of course, is that it keeps the same side facing the Earth all the time. As it rotates around the Earth, it turns at the same rate that it rotates. And so you'll always see the Earth and always be able to send back the microwave beams to the Earth. And this would be the living quarters. And here on the ground would be the solar panels with wires in them to collect the energy and feed it to the microwave transmitters. And the microwave transmitters could be as simple as the ones that are in your microwave oven. It's a very, very old and reliable technology. And this would be some of the machinery that would have to be built or brought up. Some would clearly have to be brought up to get started. There exists plenty of iron, aluminum on the moon to make things out of. And the processes to do it are well known. I want to go back one slide to the previous slide, which again gives an overview of what the whole project would look like. You could do this, and it would work, if you just beam the microwaves to the side of the planet that was facing you. It might be in sunlight, it might be at night. It depends upon where the sun is relative to the Earth, but the moon is always getting the sunlight, and so you could always be beaming it back. But of course, you could only do that for 12 hours a day. And so an adjunct to this is to put up satellites, inexpensive satellites, which would receive the solar energy. And again, they don't have to collect it. So you don't have to have massive solar photovoltaic devices, basically. Would receive the solar energy and either relay it through electronic devices or reflect it through some kind of mirrored surface. Much, much lighter than the power satellites that were proposed years ago. And with those, you could beam it anywhere on the planet. So that's the basic idea. The proposal is, within 15 years, to produce as much electricity as the United States uses now. The United States uses about half the electricity in the world, and it's about 1 terawatt. That's 1,000 billion watts. It's a lot of energy, but actually most of the energy used on the planet is not electrical energy at this point. The total energy used is about 17 terawatts, and most of it is, again, thermal energy used in various ways from fossil fuels. The conversion rate for getting from fossil fuels to electrical power is about 3 to 1. It takes about 3 times as much energy in the fossil fuels to get the energy you want in the electricity. And so that's the plan then, is to provide that initially 1 terawatt of power for the United States, and then sell the power at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, which you could do and sort of basically amortize the cost of sending people to the moon and that whole project, that whole $1 trillion at a reasonable amount of time. And then use the funds to keep on building more and more panels so that you were producing more and more power from the moon. And again, by about 2050, you would be able to replace all the fossil fuels with cheap renewable electrical energy. How cheap? The estimate is by the end of this time, the price would be about 1/10 cent per kilowatt hour. Now that's a significant reduction. For us, certainly, it's about 10% of what we're paying now. But that's not the main point. The main point is that's a price that 1/3 of the world who doesn't have any electrical power could afford. And what would be required would be to be able essentially to build a receiver for one of those beams of microwaves coming down from the planet, from the moon. And those receivers are very inexpensive. Because the power that you're getting down is 200 watts per square meter, they don't have to be very big. You could power much of Houston by an array that would be, maybe 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And it's essentially a grid of diodes, basically, which can be put up in the air so you can use the space underneath. Sunlight goes through them. It absorbs the microwaves, but the sunlight, much shorter wavelength, goes right through. Rather inexpensive, could be afforded by developing economies. They could have access to really inexpensive power through one of these beams. All one has to do is to reprogram the computers on the moon and send the beam down to where it's wanted. Now that's important because if we do not figure out a way to provide the people of this planet who have never had access to electrical power, who have insufficient access to electrical power, and if you put those two together, that's most of the people on the planet. Even if we succeed in getting off of fossil fuels ourselves, even if we succeed, they will use fossil fuels to develop their economies. They've been cheaper. They'll continue to be cheaper, at least until these other alternatives are put in place. I should say, however, that the alternative of building it on the planet, I talked about earlier, the best that can be expected after 15 years is power being provided at about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And then by 2050, after 35 years, it could be down to about the same price that we have now. At least those are the estimates in the engineering studies that have been done so far. So they wouldn't, in fact, if we do it on the planet, they would not, in fact, handle really an essential political problem that we have, which is that the developed nations, the wealthy nations, can't continue with the lifestyle that they have, even if they do it without continual reliance on fossil fuels, even if they manage to get off of fossil fuels. The rest of the world is going to want to have something like the lifestyle that we have. Now, maybe not everybody will want it. It's not to say that it's even better. But certainly your children live longer. Your health is better. It's easier to live. You can do things that aren't simply survival things. I mean, we have plenty of time on our hands to, a lot of us are unemployed, which is another matter we'll get to perhaps in a bit. about the dysfunctionality of our economic system. But it is something that the rest of the world is going to want to have, despite its limitations. And they're going to continue to burn fossil fuels. And so we will not have resolved the problem. I just want to make that again clear again. This is something we're all in together. Climate change is something that affects the entire planet. You know, we've had this sort of silly business at the various climate conferences that have occurred, where basically the United States has sabotaged the agreements. And it said things like, well, until you agree to cut your, to make limitations on your, talking about China, for instance, particularly, sort of a major developing country, then you can't really expect us to put hard, fast limitations on what we do. Well, that doesn't work in the long run. It may be possible that we're moving into a new phase, that this government and this administration is taking seriously the challenges before us. But I've shared with you already the scale of what needs to be done. We're talking about many trillions of dollars if you do it on the planet. By comparison with the Lunar Solar project, the cost of producing 1 terawatt of electrical power out of solar, either photovoltaics or thermal, costed out by again, the engineering studies, is about $5.5 trillion. That's about more than 5 times as much as the prediction of going to the moon. And the reasons for that are that you have to move much more mass around in terms of batteries, and the panels themselves have to be robust because we have weather, and you have to have more of them. The area that's of land that's projected to be needed throughout the world is about the area of Texas, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey put together, if you're going to do it on the planet. If you're going to do it from the moon, it's about 100,000 square kilometers. You could fit it comfortably into one of our western states. And that's again because you're using 200 watts per square meter coming down. You're not subject to the weather. You don't have to have batteries, or at least not batteries to the extent that are necessary for taking care of the uncertainties in the weather. Solar panels on the moon can be very skimpy. There's no weather at all. There's no wind. People think about micrometeorites, and there are some of those, but they come by once in a million years. Might damage a microwave generator or something. So it turns out to be really actually much more economical to collect it on the moon and beam it back than it is to collect it here where we can use it. That's somewhat counterintuitive. It seems like a difficult thing to go to the moon and do anything there, but we can do it. The costs were generated by a study that was done some years ago. General Dynamics was costing out these computer satellite idea, and that was modified to cost out what would be the cost of sending people to the moon and machinery to the moon, etc. So that's the situation that we're in. I hope you'll call in with questions. I'd be glad to answer any of them. And we have ways out. We can do it on the planet. There are big costs. We can do it using solar power collected on the moon. The costs are much less. It requires an engineering project of a scale we haven't done yet. The pieces are in place, but the systems engineering hasn't been done to keep a colony basically on the moon. We can do that. It's a natural extension of our living habitat. We used to live in caves. We now build houses. We used to burn firewood. We now have all kinds of sources of energy, including fossil fuels. They're piped into our home. We refurbish our environment. We remake it so that we can live in it more easily. We can do that same thing with the moon. We can use it as a source of solar energy for the planet. The kind of prosperity that's available by doing that, by 2050, the estimate is you could produce 20 terawatts of power from the moon. That's enough to replace all the electrical energy, not all the energy used on the planet, fossil fuel and otherwise, at 1/10 cent a kilowatt hour. Cheap electricity means you can do things like desalinate water. We can solve that problem. It means you can do things like take the CO2 out of the air that's still there, which will still be a problem. Electrical energy is really the most usable form of energy, and it's available in that kind of abundance, can produce abundance for the entire population of the world. 10 billion people could thrive with incomes comparable to $80,000 a year for us now. Again, because you have the energy is the critical bottom line in that. You can recycle things. You can go to a hydrogen economy, so you don't have to pollute your cities by driving around in them. That's what's available. What's in the way is a political system which doesn't look like it has the resources in the sense of really the heart, I think is what I would say, to make the kind of changes that are needed, to invest the kind of resources that are needed, to produce the kind of engineering systems that are needed. Partly that's because we live in a society which is so stratified that the people who are making the decisions, the 1%, and that's really not even quite accurate. It's more like 1/10 or 100%, are the people who have the capacity to make these changes. I think we have a caller on the line. I'd be delighted to take your call.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
You're on the air.
I'll make a couple of comments and hang up about the harvesting of methane ice. And also, they say fusion is 50 years off. And I understand we need from the moon that helium-3 for that. Is that what's holding up fusion, is the harvesting of helium-3 from the moon? Thank you. Good show.
Yeah. No, it's not. It's not really. What's holding it up? Actually, I began my career working in fusion. When I was in high school, the ideas of powering the planet with fusion power, and you saw that wonderful show Back to the Future where they throw a banana in the back of a car, and that's enough to power it for a year. That promise, it remains unfulfilled, and I think what you say is correct, that we don't expect to have it for 50 years, maybe 30 years, because the investment hasn't been made. That project, I watched it being basically, in terms of the significance, begin minimal resources. The most probable successful fusion reactor is something called a tokamak, which was originally a Russian design. We now have an international cooperation to build what's online to be built is a power reactor. It's a prototype, but it will produce more power than goes into it to keeping the fusion reaction going. It's a huge construction project. It's a huge engineering project, and it just hasn't been funded to the level that, given its importance, and still isn't really. There's still discussions going on about whether we should continue to support it and so on. The money was funneled to a project which was of more interest to the weapons manufacturers, which was you shoot beams of lasers at a small pellet, and you try to compress the pellet so strongly that eventually you get nuclear fusion in the pellet. The obvious problem has been that the pellet tends to shoot away, and various kinds of instabilities. It hasn't really succeeded. I'm not quite sure where they're at, but I never thought it was likely to work, and it doesn't look like it is. So that's really been this. It's I think the same problem we're going to face with doing something with simpler technologies, is that the people who control the resources, to some extent because I suspect that they feel themselves protected from these changes, or they don't believe in them, or their oil company, or they're making profits from the oil companies, and they don't see that they could just as easily take those resources and make profits. So within the present context of a kind of capitalist competitive system, where very, very big differences between the people making the decisions and the people who are going to have to suffer the fate of those decisions. I'm not optimistic that we can resolve that. But I'm having this conversation because ultimately it's you and I and the people who inhabit this planet and can see that we're all in it together, can see that we need to stand with each other, that the kind of, dog-eat-dog fight for controlling resources, and, in the case of oil, which is running out anyway, we'll keep on fighting till the last man standing, turns out the lights, is not something we want to do, and it's not something that the vast majority of people want to do. So we need to find ways out of the system that we're involved in, ways to make the kind of technological solutions that I've been talking about possible politically. That's where it's really at. So I encourage you all, if you're interested, to find out more about the Lunar Solar Power Project. There's a website, Lunar Solar Power Project. You can look at the Stanford results, DeLucci and Jacobson. You can pull that up on the website. They have another website where you can go to find out how many jobs will be produced by producing the energy we need here on the planet with renewables. It's 800,000 jobs for Texas, 40-year jobs, not 2-year jobs or 3-year jobs building a pipeline and then 100. So it's we have the way out. It requires the political will. It requires working together. I ask that you all put that on your agenda as something that you're going to make part of your life, understanding what the issues are, talking to people about the possibilities, coming up with ways of transforming our political and economic culture so that we can actually get this massive problem handled. I want to thank you for listening. Again, I'm George Reiter, professor of physics at the University of Houston and co-chair of the Harris County Green Party. We'll be back next week with a different show and a different host. Thanks for listening. Till then, take care. Have fun.